happy to be here for the Protect 2022 conference, and so grateful that everyone here is united today to address this issue of child sexual abuse. Well, thank you so much for having me and hosting this important event on child sexual abuse and exploitation. My name is Haley McNamara, and I'm Vice President at the National Center on Sexual Exploitation and Director of our International Division. And it's so vital and powerful that you are all gathered together today to work on this issue of child sexual abuse and exploitation and really bring this issue out of the shadows. Because so often that is where this issue lies. People don't talk about it, but in actuality, child sexual abuse, you yourself are a survivor or someone that you know. And if you think to yourself about the people in your life, your friends, your family members, your work colleagues, you may not know that many of them have had experiences of child sexual abuse, but unfortunately, so many have. I remember growing up, I had a very close friend, and it was decades later when I learned that they had been sexually abused by a family member as a child. Again, there was another friend in our group who it was over 20 years later until I learned that this young person had been solicited online by a predator to send sexually explicit photos of herself online. And in my work at the National Center on Sexual Exploitation, I constantly am connecting with survivors of sex trafficking who were sold by traffickers to be sexually abused while still children. So this is an issue that touches all of our lives in so many different ways. And I think it's important to realize that all of these different forms of sexual abuse and exploitation really create an intricate spider web where all of these issues are overlapping and connecting, especially with child sexual abuse. Child sexual abuse does not exist in a vacuum. It's connected to sex trafficking, to pornography, to sexual violence, to sexting even, and of course to child pornography or child sexual abuse materials. So we see that all of these issues overlap and intersect and reinforce one another. But when we understand that, we can also start to clear a path forward to break out of these shadows and to bring some light in. So I know that that's what you'll all be doing throughout this conference. And to really begin opening up this conversation, I would love to give an overview of child sexual abuse and exploitation, some of the basic definitions and issues facing our world today. Broadly speaking, the term child sexual abuse encompasses a wide spectrum of issues of sexual acts enacted on people below 18 years of age. There's no one definition of child sexual abuse and exploitation, although it's important to always realize that any sex act between an adult and a child is considered child sexual abuse because it's recognized internationally that children, due to developmental limitations, do not have the capacity to give consent. But the World Health Organization helps to bring this all into a bit more clarity, and they say that child sexual abuse may include, but is not limited to, the inducement or coercion of a child to engage in any unlawful sexual activity, the exploitive use of a child in the sex trade or any other unlawful sexual practice. And I would pause there and note, sometimes we hear a phrase child prostitution, or we hear the phrase underage prostitution. But the reality is that there's no such thing as a child prostitute, because anyone under international law who's under the age of 18 and is being bought and sold for sex is by definition a sex trafficking victim. So that's why the World Health Organization says any child being used in the sex trade is experiencing child sexual abuse. And the World Health Organization goes on to add, there's also the exploitive use of children in pornographic materials. And sometimes this is called child pornography. Increasingly, we use the term child sexual abuse materials, or CSAM for short, because it puts into greater clarity what is actually happening on the screen or in those materials, is that it is crime scene footage of the abuse of a child. So that's why we prefer to use child sexual abuse materials, or CSAM, to child pornography. Let's go through quickly a few myths and versus facts about child sexual abuse to make sure, as we're opening the conversation through this conference, we're all on the same page. It's important to realize that child sexual abuse does not always require physical contact between the abuser and the child. For example, maybe showing children pornography or exposing oneself to a minor, or convincing a minor to expose themselves either in person or over the internet can be a form of child sexual abuse. And so can exchanging sexually obscene messages between an adult and a child. That can also be a form of child sexual abuse. So that's important for us to remember. Also, many people, when they think of child sexual abuse, will think only of an adult abuser. Unfortunately, there is child-on-child harmful sexual behavior, which can be a sexual abuse. So that could include maybe an older juvenile who uses their age, their physical strength, or their status or authority to engage sexually with a younger child, or with a child who is cognitively impaired. Or child-on-child sexual abuse could occur between children of a similar age, and sometimes even among young children, which unfortunately, the reason why this happens is typically either because the child themselves had been sexually abused prior and then acted out that abuse onto another child, or that child was exposed to hardcore pornography, often online, and again wanted to act out what they had seen on another child. So that's a rising problem around the globe, and important to remember it's a dynamic in this issue. There's another myth about stranger danger. So it is true that strangers can abuse, and unfortunately do abuse, children sexually. However, the research shows that interpersonal child sexual abuse is typically perpetuated by a family member, a friend, or an acquaintance of the family. In fact, it's been demonstrated that 89% of perpetrators of child sexual abuse are known to the victim. So that's really important for us to realize, especially as we're building out policies, even within our own organizations, or safety practices, and within our own families, or conversations with our children about realizing that it might be someone who's a close family friend. It might even be a member of your own family who could act out on your child. So being armed really with that information is not to be scary, but it's really to actually be empowering and making sure that those 89% of perpetrators are accounted for in our policies and in our safety practices and discussions. And another myth is that child sexual abuse only happens to young girls. Now, girls are disproportionately victims of sexual abuse at nearly any age, but approximately 16% of males were sexually abused as children before the age of 18. And that number is likely low. Likely there's many more that aren't captured in that statistic, because there are sometimes extra barriers to disclosure for boys or young men to report sexual victimization. Tragically, research has shown that often boys are met with more distrust than girls are when they report such abuse. And that's because of some victim blaming and rape myths that are very prevalent in so many of our cultures. So that's important to realize, is that child sexual abuse, it's not limited by gender, it's not limited by personal background, by wealth, by if someone seems to be doing well or not in school. Unfortunately, this is, like I said, a crime that's happening in the shadows, but is prevalent in so many of our lives. So being armed with some of these basic definitions and understandings of child sexual abuse, let's zoom out and think about the world today, especially post-COVID and the rise of the internet as an even larger part of all of our lives on a day-to-day basis. And because of that, and in tandem with the natural evolution, you could say, of our society, we're finding around the world that the global frontier of child sexual abuse is online sexual exploitation. And now online sexual exploitation is often facilitated by grooming, which is the practice of building a relationship between the predator or the abuser and the victim, in these cases, a child. And that grooming can really occur on virtually any major interactive platform. Often people will ask me, well, what social media app or what online game do I just need to keep my child off in order to completely protect them? And unfortunately, all of these platforms have weaknesses that abusers can extort and that they can use. If they can have a conversation with your child, they can groom your child. And one study found that children could become victims of online grooming in as little as 17 minutes. That is how long it could take for someone to contact a child and establish enough of a relationship to earn that child's trust and maybe to get information or images from the child that could be used to extort them, to blackmail them, and then to facilitate abuse. A recent report found that 1 out of 3 youth aged 9 to 17 years old reported an online sexual interaction on social media. 1 in 3. Such as being asked for a nude image or video, being asked to do a sexually explicit live stream, or being sent a nude photo or video or sexually explicit messages. This is unfortunately just an omnipresent threat in children's lives online. And we know that this is a rising problem globally as well, because reports of online enticement, so that could be either soliciting sex from a child or soliciting explicit imagery from a child, those reports increased by 97.5% between 2019 and 2020. They increased by 97.5%. And that is why it is so timely and important for you all to be having this conversation right now, because we really are at a global tipping point of online child sexual abuse in a way that we haven't experienced before as a world or as a society. And reports of child sexual abuse materials or child pornography have really grown exponentially in recent years. In 1998, there were around 3,000 reports of that kind of material every year. In 2014, there were 1 million reports of that material. In 2019, there were 18.4 million reports of child sexual abuse materials. And remember, each of those images is a crime scene footage portraying the abuse of a child. Very often, a child who is still in the process of being abused and hasn't been rescued yet. The New York Times called this an almost unfathomable increase in criminal behavior, likely because as the internet has made it easier for people to connect, it's made it easier to groom children, to self-produce these materials, and it's easier than ever to create and share these materials as well. A 2018 study published by Interpol and ECPAT International, which analyzed more than 1 million child sexual abuse materials, found that 84% of the images and videos depicted actual sexual abuse of a child. And over 60% of those million images of unidentified victims were prepubescent, including infants and toddlers. And tragically, often the younger victims were more likely to experience more severe abuse. So these are not just pictures and videos. Again, this is actual abuse that's happening. In addition, we know online that social media itself is just removing previous barriers to grooming victims, for whether that's for abusers, for traffickers, and pimps. Some social media grooming tactics include meeting a child in real life, maybe outside of a school, on a street, or in the community, and asking to follow them and find them on social media in order to maintain contact. Sometimes people will reach out directly online and establish a relationship online first, or they might build the relationship from that point forward, either leading to meeting in person where the child might be abused, or to sending explicit images and videos. And those materials can be used to blackmail the child into silence and further abuse, or those materials could be sold online. And tragically, some minors and adults have had their sexual abuse videos uploaded online. And we're not talking about the dark web, on mainstream platforms, including pornography platforms like Pornhub and OnlyFans, and also social media platforms like Twitter. which is currently facing a lawsuit for facilitating child sexual abuse materials of sex trafficking victims who were minors at the time of their abuse. So what can we do? Because the good news is that this is not an issue that is going to remain in the shadows. Your participation in this will help ensure that we don't remain in the shadows. As parents, being involved in your children's life is vital. Having ongoing conversations with your child around their personal boundaries, around issues like pornography, learning about warning signs of possible sexual abuse in your own child's behavior, and also the harms of child-on-child harmful sexual behavior. Thankfully, there are a multitude of resources to help you get started, some of which are on our website at endsexualexploitation.org. And policymakers, what can policymakers do? There's so many ways that we can make a difference, including pursuing legislation where privacy and safety settings are turned on by default for minors on platforms and devices, or making sure that new products or platforms where children are active are built with safety in mind instead of putting on the guardrails after children have already been harmed on an online platform. There's also consumer age verification requirements for accessing platforms knowingly hosting pornography, or greater restrictions on the ability of adult strangers to find or contact minors online. There's so much that can be done here. And thankfully, progress is possible. It's happening around us as we speak. In the United Kingdom, they have a guidance on safety by design principles, calling for platforms to build their platform to be safe at the beginning. And that's something that we're seeing take off across the world as well. Also in the UK, there's currently a pending legislation called the Online Safety Bill, which would establish a new regulatory framework to tackle online harms. And in the European Union, there are really strong plans to fight child sexual abuse online, with a new law obliging tech firms to report child sexual abuse materials. Previously, they were able to report child sexual abuse materials on a voluntary basis, but this legislation would require them to do so, and that's an important step forward. We've seen also in the past, France and Germany have passed consumer age verification to keep children off of pornography websites. And as we discussed earlier, there is that connection between pornography and not only the grooming of children, but also child-on-child sexual abuse. So that's really important. And the Council of Europe has a committee which passed a resolution calling for further awareness about the harms of pornography, especially regarding sexual violence and child abuse as well. There's also fantastic opportunities just as individuals speaking out when you see any kind of sexual abuse or exploitation. Such as through a project that our organization does called the Dirty Dozen List. At dirtydozenlist.com, everyone can go and learn about 12 mainstream companies that are facilitating sexual abuse and exploitation in some form or another. And it's an opportunity to reach out to that company on social media, to send them an email even. And amazingly, we've seen victory after victory happen through this Dirty Dozen list, including companies like TikTok and Instagram, making it so that stranger adults can no longer send direct messages to children on those platforms. How significant is that for preventing some online grooming? Or, for example, Google Chromebooks were being given away en masse with COVID and online learning. So people are being given these laptops to do their school. And unfortunately, they were given without any safety features turned on. After being on the Dirty Dozen list, Google Chromebooks now has the safety features turned on by default when given to school children. Such a simple step, but it can prevent so much harm. So I just encourage you, whether it's through the Dirty Dozen list or just as an individual yourself, to speak out when you see a corporation or an entity that could be doing better to help prevent child sexual abuse and exploitation, because victories are very possible there, in addition to the legislation that I shared about. And so it's so helpful to know that this hope is real and it's in front of us right now, and you can be part of this movement. And we know that it's helpful to stop and think back to those people in our lives again. And if they've been abused themselves, to remember that every human being deserves the opportunity to live life to its fullest potential, to pursue dreams, hope, joy, and love with family and friends, and really to thrive. And that's why we're all here, is because we want to build a world where that is possible and a reality for every child on this planet. So you're not alone. You're part of a united global movement. And thank you so much for being here and for making a difference. Thank you.